My name's Andrew Noble, and what we'll be doing today is continuing our series, our jam sessions, as we like to call them here at Plum, going through topics that, yes, relate to HR, but aren't just for HR professionals. Thank you for joining us, regardless of your background. I know that we have some senior leaders here and some people that are just simply interested in this topic of diversity and inclusion. Just before we go into the details of the actual webinar itself, a little bit of housekeeping. We will be sharing a recorded version of this webinar afterwards. We'd also love to hear from you. So we'll be sending a brief survey after the webinar. We'll also have some time for some Q&A and at the end, as well as some live feedback throughout. If you have any issues throughout the presentation, feel free to email Andrea at Plum.io. She'll be able to help you out. Just a little bit about Plum before we go into the webinar as well. So Plum uses analytics and science to humanize the hiring process. What we do at Plum is actually understand who people really are, their social intelligence, their personality, and problem solving, and figure out if those job-related skills match the role requirements. This gets us away from some of the unconscious bias normally involved in that hiring process. We've assessed over 150,000 applicants through our survey, and our customers are incredibly satisfied. Our success rate is at 93%. And so really at Plum, we're predicting certainty. That's our slogan. So diversity by design. That's what we're here to talk about today. Not just stumbling into diversity, not just thinking that it's a nice quota to go about, but how do we design for it? Today I'm happy to be joined by two great experts in this area. Denise Thompson, she's the VP of Human Capital Management at Intact Financial Corporation. At that organization, one of our customers, it's actually Canada's largest property and casualty insurer. I know that you're quite the champion of diversity initiatives there. Even last week, you were doing some training with your executive team. And you are the co-chair of Intact's Diversity and Inclusion Council. Thank you for joining us today, Denise.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
No worries at all. Thomas as well, great to have you here. You're the co-founder of Sexual and Gender Diversity Research Lab at the University of Guelph. I know you're a PhD candidate as well, and in our favorite field of study at Plum, industrial organizational psychology at the University of Guelph as well. And I know your research is really dedicated to understanding and improving the experiences of diverse and marginalized populations. And so thank you for your work there, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So in terms of this presentation, the outcomes that we hope to get to, one of the first things that we'll be walking through is some of the workplace diversity disasters and what we can learn from them. Also, we'll be talking about identifying how to structure your talent processes, to really design your recruitment processes, hiring and reporting, to figure out how that diversity and inclusion narrative or D&I narrative can become a part of that. Also, we'll be learning how to apply the scientific method to your diversity initiatives. Now, thinking about this idea of diversity and inclusion, Iris Bonnet, she's the author of What Works, and she kind of made this comparison between hotel rooms and environmental initiatives like turning off lights and diversity. She said it's not so much just putting up signposts and raising awareness that people would turn off their lights. Something that we can do, because as much as we try as humans to do what we try to do, we sometimes leave the lights on, so to speak. What we could do instead is solve the problem through a bit of technology and some smart design. So we're going to be talking about some of those design principles today to improve our diverse workforces. Before I do that, I really want to hear from the audience in terms of why you're here today. So we're going to put a question up on the screen now in terms of which statement best describes why you're attending this webinar on diversity and inclusion. So if you can right now, please take advantage of that GoToMeeting option and share your responses with us. So my company wants to avoid the risk of diversity disaster, or perhaps it's my company recognizes diversity and so you want to be part of that chain process, or you yourself are responsible for diversity. Tell us a little bit more about why you're here today. And I'll just give a little bit more time for people to respond. Feel free to respond in that GoToWebinar control panel, and you can share your results there. We seem to be having some difficulties here just in terms of the tech, as we're not getting some of the questions quite yet. Okay, here we go. There's some responses coming in now. So people feeling, oh, they're responsible for it. My company recognizes diversity. Great. So keep those responses coming in, and then we'll be sharing those with you. So it looks like we have a pretty good mix here today in terms of how people are responsible for diversity, and some people here that are just wanting to be invested in it, and a few people as well that also want to avoid the risk of the diversity disasters. And so in that context of avoiding those diversity disasters, I know, Denise, we had this conversation earlier about, well, what's the positive perspective we can take on this? You know, they're disasters, but we can learn from them. And so why don't you share a little bit of that perspective with us?
Thanks, Andrew. Let's start with Google. So as you know, there was a 10-page memo that was circulated as a manifesto by one of Google's former employees. And we can talk about that a little bit further, but before we call it a disaster, I would say it's an opportunity to bring awareness to Google about how some of the folks in their workplace might be feeling. And I also think we need to recognize the significant efforts Google themselves have made to create a positive workplace culture with, of course, room for improvement. They've got some really valuable practices, including the use of data to identify the cause of the gender gap. So they're at the forefront of this diversity by design. They're spending their efforts to understand what's behind it, look at the data to see what's going on. And a great example is gender at Google. They noted that the numbers of women were falling, dove into the data to see what was going on, and found that women were turning over at a higher rate than men. So why was that? Dove deeper into the data and found that women who were leaving on maternity leave weren't coming back. So this meant a need to change in a design. And in that case, they put in place a maternity leave program. And today, Google's turnover of women is similar to men. So I think they care about this topic. They care about gender diversity, and they've made considerable effort to make change. But back to the diversity disaster. So they've spent some considerable effort on training an implicit bias and the value it brings to the customer in the workplace. And my take on the firing of the memo writer was similar to an ex-Googler named Jonathan Zunger. I think the memo writer missed the point. Google needs engineers who can solve problems for customers, and to do that, they need people who can cooperate, collaborate, and have empathy. And these are perhaps job attributes that should be part of the interview process at Google, and in addition to the technical coding skills that are needed. It's a predominantly male industry, and Google has 31% women employees. So they do have an opportunity here to be a magnet for women if the organization is designed for it. And I think in that design, what are the signals that they are sending? What do their job descriptions say? How are people rewarded? And what's the messaging around gender diversity and diversity in their roles? So I commend Google for encouraging an open dialogue, but holding the line at an unfounded commentary that I believe would create a toxic environment.
Mm-hmm. And then there's, I guess, another big diversity disaster that's been in the news recently, and that's based out of Uber. And in February of this year, Susan Fowler posted a blog comment about her experiences of sexism within Uber as an organization and through the multiple layers of Uber's company. And this was a case where Uber wasn't necessarily looking at the data. They didn't collect the data around different marginalized groups or minority populations, and so they didn't know that there was necessarily problems emerging. If you don't have the data, how do you identify problems? And so that was one learning that I think we can take from the Uber case. But one of the other pieces that really emerged from Susan Fowler's blog post was that the HR system itself was not constructed in a way that really fostered D&I excellence or D&I understanding. So individuals would go and complain to human resources about what was happening, and records weren't being kept. There were issues where individuals' concerns were being dismissed, and there was absolutely not a case for confidentiality and anonymity within the HR system. And this is really problematic when we talk about diversity and inclusion, when we know that these kinds of factors really contribute to the organizational culture. And so we now have a culture where bias is emerging against different groups, and that's really difficult to see and really difficult to make adaptations to in terms of creating a meritocracy in how individuals are rewarded, promoted, or even maintained. And as Susan indicated in her blog post, during her time, she saw representation of women fall from 35% down to 6%. And that's something an employee saw, but that the organization itself didn't have the data to support. So this is one of those cases where we can learn from other mishaps about what we can be doing to change.
So great points, Thomas, and I think Tesla is another example of a similar situation, and in this case, again, gender-based concern that also showed itself in other parts of the organization related to safety. So one of Tesla's female engineers, for those who don't know, took Tesla to task for what she claims were unfair practices in promotions, a really toxic work environment where women were catcalled or ignored when they spoke up. This woman is an engineer in the organization, and in spite of 20-odd complaints about harassment and unequal pay from women, Tesla's leadership team did not take any action. And as a result, they ended up with a lawsuit, which later led to the firing of the employee who led the lawsuit, and it continues on with further litigation. So this is a great case of where someone who's hard driving and perhaps early on with a small team of similar people working together to get the job done at all costs might have worked. But achieving an objective in an environment that doesn't make everyone feel welcome and brings all perspectives to the table, in the end will decrease productivity, has a cost on reputation, in this case legal fees, and in the safety of their employees. So I think that creating a culture of trust and transparency and inclusion is a critical element in design of workplaces today. Workers are a really trusted voice, and they're speaking out, and it has impact. And in the case of many of these organizations, that impact is a shareholder revolt.
Yeah, and it's almost like you realize too late the business impact of some of this, the D&I faults, which is part of the lessons that we can learn from these cases. And that's our emphasis here. We're not finger pointing. We're saying what can we learn so that it doesn't happen to our own organizations. So first, stop simple diversity training only focused on raising awareness. We need to go beyond that. Second, focus on the entire employee life cycle, not just hiring and getting people in seats, but what about those turnover numbers and tracking those numbers? There's a silver lining to all of this in terms of these events can become a catalyst for change. So, you recognize something goes wrong, and then there's a result that comes out of it that endorses the importance of diversity and inclusion. 4, ensure that diversity and inclusion efforts are directly tied to business outcomes. Think about this as part of your business strategy so that it's higher valued across the entire organization. And lastly, treat diversity and inclusion initiatives as two separate but related ideas. And this is something that we're about to unpack. I know, Thomas, you try to educate your students in terms of helping them understand what do these terms, diversity and inclusion, really mean. Can you help us understand that before we go too far into this presentation?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to realize that everyone uses these terms in a bit of a different way. So we always like to come at these terms with a similar understanding, where diversity is really about the identities and demographic characteristics that categorize individuals into larger social groups. So this is the idea that when we talk about diversity, we're talking about gender, but we're also talking about race and sexual orientation and disability, that we're moving into these broader categories that encapture all people. So not just minorities. I think we often say diversity equals a focus on minorities, but everyone has a sexual orientation. Whether you're gay, pansexual, bisexual, or heterosexual, you have a sexual orientation. If you're a woman, a man, a gender nonconforming person, or gender queer, you have a gender of some sort. And so diversity is this larger aspect of incorporating everyone. Diversity does include everyone, and it has these broader implications. It's about these ideas that all of these identities work together and change and evolve over time. So right now, we talk a lot more about trans individuals in the workplace. That's something that 5, 10, 20 years ago were not being discussed in an organization. So there's a fluidness and evolving nature of what's covered within diversity and the identities that we're talking about. And I always like to stress that diversity is about embodied experience, that it's not always visible. It's not always the color of someone's skin. It's not always the gender expression that they may present to the world. There's lots of diversity that comes in different forms. And so we have to think about diversity on really broad spectrums, a political ideology, religious identity, all of these ways that might not be the most visible.
Great, great. And so there is a difference too between diversity and inclusion as well.
Right, so where diversity is about these social groups, inclusion is about the meaningful process, about actively engaging, empowering, and supporting individuals within the work environment. Inclusion is a process, it's not a destination. So we really try to think about the active and iterative process that inclusion is. So we create something, we enact it, but then we need to revisit it because we have new identities and new individuals that need to be thought about. We need to think about inclusion as everyone's responsibility. So it's not just HR, it's not just the CEO. Every employee has an ability to create a more inclusive, supportive environment that engages everyone. Now, is that something that you would experience or agree with me, Denise?
Absolutely. I'll take it back to diversity. I think back to the story of Google and YouTube and how when they first launched YouTube, they found that there was a bug. There were folks who could not, for whatever reason, get YouTube to be on their screen the way they wanted it to be. And as they went back through their design process to figure out what the issue was, they figured out that the people having issues were folks who were left-handed. So this is one of those things that maybe it's not the first thing you would think about in designing for diversity, but if you're the engineers at Google, boy, you're thinking about that today. Who was at the table when we sat down to design this? Heck, we only had right-handed folks. Then when I think of your description of inclusion, definitely that fits in the workplace, but I think inclusion has a bigger societal impact as well. If you think about the major progress you can make in a society around improving how included people feel and how they are part of the process and part of the engaged in the workplace, in education, etc. Think back to women and the impact that women's education has on a society, on the wealth of that society, and on the livelihoods of the women and their children. Mm-hmm. The impact is strong.
Yeah, and thinking about that impact, we're not just doing these diversity and inclusion initiatives for the sake of doing them. We're doing them for the results, the societal results, for the business impacts. I know there's some research on this as well, right, Thomas?
Yeah, we're really lucky to have some great research out there that demonstrates that in a lot of organizations which have incorporated gender diverse practices, that they actually see around a 15% increase in their financial performance compared to competitors who haven't prioritized gender diversity. We see similar metrics for racial diversity at 35%. And I like to talk about these numbers as being kind of soft numbers, because the actual impact on an organization of incorporating inclusion and diversity as a priority actually have larger and higher financial outcomes than we probably are able to measure. Because a lot of these measures don't take into account that we see lower turnover of employees, both minority employees and dominant group employees, when we have inclusion processes. That cuts down costs. We see individuals are more willing to engage in other types of performance, organizational citizenship behaviors, going above and beyond their job when they're in an environment that trusts them and supports them and includes their identity. And I love Denise's point about the social good that this has, and that's not reflected in these numbers. So I think these numbers are great, they're a great sign, but I think the impact is far higher around how organizations benefit from diversity and inclusion at all ranges of the organization.
Certainly, certainly. Thanks, Thomas. I think many people here attending this webinar are thinking about the value of this, and they came to this webinar perhaps agreeing with many of the things we were just speaking to. But then in terms of designing for it and making it an initiative that they're working on across their organization right now, perhaps they're thinking, okay, this will be something we planned for in 2018. This is something that we'll do as we mature as an organization, but it's a little tough right now. Denise, I know we were talking about this before. What are your thoughts on a perspective like that?
So my perspective is it's never too early to start to design for diversity, which you can see up on the screen there. I think one big lesson that we learned from these diversity disasters we spoke about earlier is that these were startups that tend to hire from within their own circles when they get started, and the people in the team are more or less like the founders. It's very comforting to be around people who are like you and who perhaps have the same thoughts, drives, ambitions as you do, and then as it starts to scale, these people are hiring from within their own networks. People make it easy, and it's a domino effect until the company that has processes in place that are really well established and employees that are accustomed to certain culture and values, and then it's much harder to work backwards to start implementing diversity and inclusion. So I say this should be, if you're a founder, this should be one of the things that you think about at the forefront, and start with what are the values you're going to have around your organization to bring in a diverse group of people.
Certainly.
And I think that it's really great kind of building off that idea of values, because when we talk about values, we know that it's not just about quotas anymore. Mm-hmm. We know that it's something bigger about our organizational mission and vision, and what are the goals that we want to achieve. So it's not just how many boxes can we check, how many individuals can we report, identify as women or Indigenous individuals, visible minorities, or people with disabilities. It goes into the true idea of inclusion. And so, what we see with the Google memo example, quotas can really backfire. It can look tokenizing. It can become problematic. But if we go beyond that into true inclusion, we actually get into this deeper level. We're no longer at the surface of inclusion.
Mm-hmm. So quotas are one thing, but pulling together data to identify your strengths and weaknesses is another. And it tells us more and helps us dive into what's going on in the organization, where might we have some problems, where do we have strengths, and what are the strategies that can help us to achieve an objective, for example. So a great example is if you know your customer base resembles the population of Toronto, and you look at your data and your workforce, do you reflect that customer base? Do you reflect the society that you're working within? And if not, why not? And take it even further. If you are in financial services, what is the visible minority labor force in your city, in your company? If you're reflective of that, that's great. If not, why aren't you? And what would the business benefit be if you were?
Great. Thanks so much for that, Denise and Thomas. As we move forward in this presentation, we're going to start speaking specifically towards 3 different areas in terms of recruiting, hiring, and reporting. And before we do that, I think it'll be helpful to hear from the audience again in terms of what are your thoughts in these 3 areas. Overall, how confident are you that your company's recruiting, hiring, and reporting processes are designed for diversity and inclusion? Now, hopefully you'll see that poll in progress on your screen now, and you'll be able to click the response. Perfect. Now we're seeing those results come in. So there's actually a pretty wide diversion coming in. Keep responding as you see that on your screen. About 20% of people are unsure. There's almost maybe 40% or more people that are on that side of not being as confident as they'd like to be, in terms of recruiting, hiring, and reporting. Somewhat confident, we have about a quarter of people in the room, or slightly over that are feeling confident. So there's a mix here. And I think that's reflective of a lot of us who we're always trying to improve. I know with inclusion, Thomas, you were talking about, it's not always just a destination, or it's not a destination. It's an iterative process that we're always trying to improve. Related to this, and thank you for your responses to that poll. We appreciate you participating, and there are some people that have started to write some questions in. Please continue to write questions as we have time at the end to answer them. So these stats on the screen right now, they kind of speak to how people value it. 82% agree that inclusion is required to translate diversity into performance results, like innovation. So most people strongly agree, but only 10% strongly agree that they take advantage of these benefits. It's actually rare to see people actualize on this belief. And that's where we really need to get into designing for diversity. That's where we need to set up our processes to not just bring awareness to the topic. Yes, that's good. But what can we do to design in different areas of hiring and recruiting in order to really build out processes that stay away from implicit bias and other diversity disaster results. So in order to walk through this, I know, Thomas, you kind of have a bit of a scientific method approach for us to walk through.
Yeah, so for me, I always believe that if we follow the scientific approach, we're actually able to better understand what's going on and remove some of the bias into why we think things are going on and use data to inform our approaches. So we'll talk about today the current state, how to educate our actions, and how to measure, and how this is an iterative process to enhance our diversity competence.
Okay, so let's jump into current state first.
Sure. So I think that I can take this one. This is a practice that we have implemented at my workplace at Intact, and it's really taking a moment or taking some time to take a look at your recruiting, hiring, performance management methods, and investigate where there might be particular barriers. That means looking at the data, whatever data you have, and figuring out how you can add data in for the future so you can measure where you're going. So consider what might be getting in the way and what those barriers are. I also highly recommend that you include others in your process, because you're coming with your own implicit bias and maybe missing some elements as well. So consider who's on the team, who's looking at this, that you have a diverse team to look at the current state, and then start to set measures of what it is you want to achieve and develop your action plan around that. So we'll talk about action plan further down the line here, but I'll leave it for that.
Okay, and then I know there's been some research too, thinking about the current state across workforces in terms of men applying to jobs compared to women. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Denise?
Sure. So Hewlett-Packard did this great study in their workplace to look at why it was that they were not seeing women progress in the organization, and did an iterative process to look at all of their different structures, etc. A great finding from this research was that when it came to applying for a job, men were likely to apply when they had 60% of the qualifications. And for women, they would apply when they had 100% of the qualifications. How do you design for this? Well, there's multiple ways you can design for this. Knowing that this may be happening in your organization as well, you can take the effort to help women to understand that we're willing to have them come on board with that learning agility. It may mean tapping some people on the shoulder, and it may mean communicating to the employees at large that you're open to this. And it's not about the skills necessarily, every element of the job. It's also about how did you post that job? How did that message get out about what the job entails? Could it be that learning agility is more important than how long the person's been in the job, or whether they've acquired and worked on a particular technology or skill for 3 to 5 years?
Great. So our job descriptions are impacted too when we're thinking about this in the context of recruiting.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that when we think of recruiting, understanding that a lot of what we do has the potential to actually incorporate bias within it, even though these are practices we've been using for decades. So one of the pieces that I always like to think about are resumes. There's some great research coming out of the US right now around the resume whitening process. And it's the idea that when a resume has a name that appears to be white, so John Smith, Jane Doe, that those resumes, even if they're identical to resumes in which the name appears to be non-English, non-white, that the white resumes are rated as substantially more qualified. And I just have to emphasize that the qualifications are identical. What school they went to, what program, the past experience. It's purely based off of the name. And so our recruiting efforts need to start thinking about how do we remove some of those components within the process. If we're recruiting based off of certain metrics or requiring through that we need to be more careful. So be more cognizant of how we're posting and what we're requesting from individuals through our recruitment.
So listing what is absolutely necessary for the role, using phrasing that's accessible and inclusive of all applicants, is really some specific outcomes that we can take to better work on this recruiting side of things.
I think I'd add to that is there's some additional interesting research around the fact that when we see a resume and that individual is a woman or a man, has also an impact to it. And so on top of that, when we move into the hiring phase, there's elements that come into who walks in the door. What does that person look like? How good looking do we assume that person to be? And that has impact on our hiring decisions as well. So I think putting in place the multi-rater approach at the very beginning helps with that. But let's take a step back. As you know, jobs are often posted to career sites and they indicate a requirement of a determined number of years of experience, 3 to 5 years, for example. Then the manager brings the candidate in for an interview that aims to determine if the person's skills for the job are the correct skills and identifies whether they fit. So that's where I want to stop and talk about fit. Research conducted in the late 90s on predictive validity of various recruitment approaches led to some interesting findings. One of those was that these approaches, the approaches that we have had in place, aren't very reliable in predicting future performance. In addition to that, they did very little to minimize bias in the selection process. So I'm a proponent of a multi-tiered approach to recruitment, starting with an unbiased assessment at the beginning of the process, which helps to bring fairness to the candidate and some comfort to the manager. So I'm going to do a little plug here, Plum folks. Having a tool like Plum can produce a result that matches the job profile and the individual results before the recruiter starts screening the resume, before they even start looking at names, number of years of experience, and the skills. That reduces the likelihood that a manager who, for example, might believe that a business degree from a renowned university is required, is presented with evidence to meet a candidate that might otherwise have been screened out. So I think that, together with multiple raters who help to challenge one another on their on what they've seen from the candidate in the interview, and a rating process and a structured interview can all add to coming out with a better hiring decision. So I'm a real proponent of assessment, structured interview, multiple raters.
Great, great. And adding that structure to the process sometimes takes work, but it's worth the effort for the results you get. And now thinking about reporting and benchmarking.
Yeah, so this is a case where, and we'll get into it a bit later too, so I won't spend too much time now, is saying that companies really need to think about how are they discussing and reporting on their D&I efforts. This can be really great for your reputation if it demonstrates that you've thought about this, you've cared, you've had this detailed process in place. And so by focusing in on diversity, you're talking about how it's benefiting your organizational culture, but you're talking about how it's benefiting your stakeholders, how it's benefiting your market share. And so there's this opportunity that diversity and inclusion isn't just an internal process, but you're actually able to use it as an advertising and marketing and recruitment tool going forward. So these benchmarks help you compare yourself to your competitors, but also benchmark your progress over time, which becomes a huge reputational boost.
You just gave me a great idea, Thomas. I think it's time to showcase our approach on our career site. That's a great idea.
Cool. So speaking now back to current state, kind of recapping some of these ideas that we've been discussing. Denise, do you want to speak to this a bit?
Sure. So when we talk about designing for diversity, one of the things we need to stop and do is reflect on our current state. So the first question is, where are we at? Do managers and employees buy in? How have you invited them in? Are there champions at all levels? We talk often about is the CEO a champion? And in our organization, our CEO is a huge champion for diversity and inclusion. But it's really one of the things we've found is it's important to have buy-in at all levels to make progress, because it's the frontline managers who are recruiting together with our recruiters, and it's employees who help to create an inclusive environment. So looking at your current state and where are you at and how can you do that, it's a combination of looking at your culture. You can do that through focus groups, your employee survey, a culture survey, determining what the business case is for your organization. Is it a customer play? Is it to ensure that, for example, if women in financial services are more likely to be the buyer of your product, are women helping to design your product? Is that your business case? And then looking at what does the data tell you about where you're at today. I think those are clear components. And where can you take that data to your recruitment, your promotion, your performance, and your processes around those?
Yeah, these are some great questions. You know, there might be someone here that's screenshotting these, and then they're going to go back to their own organization and start asking these questions of others. I know you both have some thoughts around the education piece as well, an important piece.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd really just like to say around educating, it's that we need to move outside of the boardroom when we're making our decisions about D&I. We need to start engaging with individuals at all levels. Remember, inclusion is the responsibility of everyone. So taking specific time to collaborate on developing what is a D&I strategy or practice that is actually meaningful to those who the inclusion practice is based for. So use those opportunities to communicate and engage, to then develop a mentorship of subject matter experts who can be that source of advice on, is this D&I program something that will actually work for this community? Will this be something that will have long-standing effect, or is it going to be something that's unnecessary? And another great way to do that is to actually engage with thought leadership around whatever you're doing. So if you're focusing on performance appraisals, then engage with some of the great leaders who are talking about performance appraisals. When I think about diversity and inclusion, I always think of the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. They release a lot of high quality research and work that can educate you on how to do things in relation to creating inclusive recruitment, hiring, reporting processes. So the educational piece is essential to engage with others. And I think a great piece that we build on there is not just reading one report, whether it's from McKinsey, whether it's from Hewlett-Packard. There's lots of different organizations you can read research from. So take that research that's out there, talk to the members of your organization, talk to your stakeholders, and find your own organizational data to guide and educate your process going forward. Because this isn't just a case where one report will tell you the silver bullet to solve your concerns. There's lots of things out there that can inform your approach going forward.
Thomas, I think those are great points, and I would say that in educating myself through this topic of diversity and inclusion, I've referenced Catalyst, McKinsey, I've read Lean In, which I think was a great way to share with some of our colleagues and executives in the organization how it felt to be a woman, that empathy piece which helps round out diversity and implicit bias training. So I think there are many ways we can educate ourselves, and it's imperative that we all do it on an ongoing basis.
And so thinking about taking action in these areas, just for the sake of time, we'll just kind of highlight briefly this action piece in terms of developing your business case. We spoke about that in terms of the different ways that we could do that. Reviewing your culture norms for bias. So where do those exist? And identifying opportunities to be more inclusive. So the time that people have to go home, perhaps it's maternity leave, as was referenced earlier, etc. Assessing the profile required for the job. What are you really looking for? What defines fit? Are we looking at 8 years of experience, or are we looking at learning agility? Also, in terms of purposefully designing for recruitment, from job postings to how you're posting on Twitter, etc., to using an assessment, structured interview, and multi-raters, as Denise spoke to. Educate recruiters and decision makers to seek out diverse candidates. So that might be tapping someone on the shoulder or reaching out in those specific areas, and recognizing and showcasing those where diverse teams are successful and inclusive, to share those stories, as those can be very powerful. Now let's move to that last piece of measurement. What does this look like, and how can we think about measurement? I know one of the questions that came in as we were discussing earlier was what are these metrics that we should be using? What are the types of things that we should be measuring?
So it's really important that we think about our measurement actively. So if you're talking about finding out, is a program successful, having an employee survey that quantitatively measures it can be extraordinarily useful. We talk about survey fatigue all the time. I think that every organization struggles from that. But if we aren't getting the feedback on our programs, people are going to stop using them because it's not what they need. So ask purposeful surveys when you need them. And if you don't have time to do a survey, qualitatively engage with your employees. Meet with a handful of individuals during lunchtime and say, we have this program, I know you've used it in the past, how could we make it better? Or what's not working for you? So when you engage with individuals, you can do it from surveys, you can do it through focus groups, or just one-on-one conversations. And that can guide how you change and adapt your process going forward. And then share those results across the organization. It's important that data is not limited just to the individuals at the top. And it's okay if those results aren't what you're expecting. If people give you feedback that the program wasn't great, that's some of the best feedback you can get, because you're not wasting your resources. You can adapt and you can change. But if you get the good results, great, but don't stop there. Because remember, inclusion is about an iterative process. You have to keep building and improving.
Thomas, to that point, I think we've got a great example in-house. So often you'll hear that millennials are not engaged. And in our organization, we know that's not the case. We know that if you dive into the data, you can see where people are engaged and not engaged. So it's sometimes not taking the number at the top, it's diving into the groups to see what's behind it. In our case, we know that that millennials are highly engaged, where they're enabled, where their work processes are simple and easy to use, and that makes a lot of sense. So it helps to rejig where you're going if you dive deeper.
So this current state, educate, action, and measure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a process, right? It's not necessarily one and done. So I know Iris Bonas, you know, she talks about this unfreeze, change, refreeze method.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that a little bit, Denise? I know you're familiar with it.
Sure. So what Iris Bonas is referencing is that you may have started out with a plan, and you're moving along with that plan, and you need to take a moment, take a step back and say, how's my plan working? What is the data saying now that indicates whether the actions we've taken are the right ones? And perhaps that means that you need to change course, and that's okay. I think all of the organizations that have been in gender diversity for sure, and diversity in general, know that diversity and inclusion in general, know that it's sometimes you have to take corrective action and start over. So the idea is put in action, stop, look at your data, and then make your tweaks and go back at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're never stopping in terms of this ongoing approach of designing. So here at Plum, in terms of thinking what we do to support you in these areas, is we help you across these different areas. In terms of recruiting, too often we can figure out the job requirements just based on a conversation where we come up with, well, I want the perfect person who's kind of like so-and-so, and really what we're describing are things that just allow for implicit bias. With Plum, we have a survey that you actually send to your hiring managers. You get multiple raters involved in order to create those job requirements. That leads to your hiring method at the very top of the funnel, using that assessment to shortlist your candidates on something that's far more objective and relevant to actual job fit than just gut feel. Bringing a scientific approach to hiring actually humanizes the hiring process, as we're hiring people for who they are and how well they actually fit. That's the best thing we can do for them. And then thirdly, in terms of reporting, imagine having people data and metrics about your people to inform how you work with them, to inform what is our current culture state, to inform how we might work with this individual and develop them professionally. Having this data is part of the solution overall. And these are just three areas. We know that D&I is across the board in terms of many different areas. And what we'll do now is we'll actually transition into Q&A. So there has been a few questions that have come through throughout the presentation, and thank you for them. The first question that I'll pose to both of you is this. It's getting harder to sell certain business leaders on the financial improvements of diversity, especially when a company is already successful. How do I respond to this?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, something I get a lot, because a lot of organizations have already put years into their diversity and inclusion programs. And that's why I like to now think about it as more than just corporate social responsibility, but actually as a social imperative. And we're actually seeing now that when organizations achieve that one level of, okay, we've done things that have been great for our employees, it actually becomes static. And now employee engagement actually is decreasing in these organizations, not because the inclusion programs are adjusting or they're changing. It's the same inclusion program, but people have gotten used to it. And so engagement drops. So we have to keep adjusting and changing. Otherwise, we're not going to have engagement increase. We're not even going to have it stay the same. We'll have that detriment. So I think that's something we need to tell business leaders, is that yes, we're doing great, but people will become desensitized to what we have offered if we aren't innovating.
Thomas, I think that's an excellent point. I think the other side of it is how successful is successful. So is there an opportunity for even greater success? And most companies have shareholders who have an expectation of a return, and that return expectation continues. And so successful can be perhaps even more, or the opportunity for success can even be higher with that diverse background and skills of people.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Jason Williams, for that question. This next question is from Nichelle Rogers. And so I think these types of metrics like gender and race keep perpetuating the idea that diversity is about minorities. How do we find metrics that address those less visible pieces of diversity? Thomas, I know a lot of your research, this is like right up your alley.
This is right up your alley.
It is. I love this question, and thank you so much for writing this in, because you're absolutely right. A lot of ways that we measure D&I absolutely perpetuates the idea that it's just about minorities. And that's why I think when we're doing our analyses of our data, we need to be ensuring that we're getting the voices from every single employee. The one group that I get the most resistance from are straight, white, heterosexual men. I said straight and heterosexual at the same time. But they always say, well, it's not about me. I love pulling out our diversity and inclusion programs and our data to say, actually look at this diversity program and how it's actually benefiting individuals within your identity. Because when we talk about maternity programs, we actually turn them into parental programs now. And that's benefiting individuals across all genders. But we don't often demonstrate that data. We just talk about how it's good for women. We don't, when we have networking events for LGBTQ individuals, we don't talk about how it's actually really good for allies too, because they're networking and they're developing mentorship opportunities. So if we don't use that data, then we don't see those results. And then individuals think that it's just about minorities, and that's not the case.
So I think what you're saying is when you're talking about the impact of these initiatives, we need to think about that impact broadly.
Absolutely.
So that we're not just speaking about that impact in one way. And perhaps that's a specific metric in terms of participation of an event, or perhaps it's just more generally in terms of the impact.
I think there's a piece that I would add to that, that as an executive or a manager, one of the things that you're looking for is to attract talent to your organization. And we know that companies that are seen positively from a diversity and inclusion perspective are seen positively from people with all kinds of dimensions of diversity, whether it's straight white men or it's the LGBT community. It's a positive because it means that it's an inclusive environment, and I may have a different work style than someone else, but it's an inclusive environment, and that therefore I'm going to be accepted for that work style.
Great, great. The next question here is from Sarah, and she says, can you please share some examples of data organizations that are collecting or using to inform barriers?
Sure, I'm happy to share with you, Sarah. So at our company, we look at a plethora of data, and we're still building out what that data can be and how we can gather it over time. So for one thing, we created an environment that is very open and transparent about our engagement survey. We maintain confidentiality. We're very conscious of employees' opinions on our engagement survey, and we've taken action on it. So the engagement survey has become this way for us to get information where people feel very confident and trust us greatly, and we hold that trust very closely. So over time, we've used the engagement survey to get further information about the demographics of our organization, for example, and to the point where our LGBTQ and network came to us to say, we want you to put on the survey the sexual orientation of people and get people to respond to that. And we're disappointed the first year we didn't do it. So that data has become, or that tool has become a great tool for us. Then we also look at our recruitment data, our turnover data, our performance management data, for example, to see are there differences based on gender, on visible minority, etc. So we take that data to help us make decisions.
Great. So we'll ask the next question here, and this question comes from Chris, and he asks, some questions or some companies don't want to assess their current diversity and initiative state because they know the results will be bad. How do we convince them to do an assessment?
It could get a lot worse if you don't have that data. There's a lot of cases where, ignorance is not bliss. The chance for lawsuits and legal challenges increases substantially. And most courts are now saying you have an onus and responsibility to know that information, and not knowing it does not excuse you from having a responsibility to have acted in that situation. This is especially clear in cases of sexual harassment and discrimination. So if your organization doesn't want to assess the data because they know it's going to be bad, remind them about all of the precariousness of not knowing that data and what else could go even worse.
So Thomas, I'm going to close that comment with, on the positive side, it's also about helping them to understand the benefits of having a diverse workforce and understanding that workforce. So back to that, hey, you could make more money. Hey, we could do a better job with our customers if we have a diverse group at the table.
Great, and that'll wrap up our Q&A portion. Just to wrap up everything that we've talked about today, and we will be sending a copy of the webinar into your emails afterwards. But this is just our last slide to bring everything together. So some of the things we've learned today: to design processes for D&I, instead of just focusing on behavior modification, or we use that example of turning on the light switch or telling people to turn off their light switches. What if we designed processes that embedded these D&I beliefs that we had into the organization? And ensuring that those D&I efforts are tied to business outcomes. I love, Denise, when you spoke of what do we measure? We're measuring for turnover. We're measuring for business results, and then we're comparing that across groups, and we're also seeing how the D&I efforts can lead to these positive outcomes. Focus on the entire employee life cycles, not just hiring quotas. We spoke about that in multiple ways. And values are the foundation of this strategy. It's not just about that quota, the value behind it. We can be applying the scientific method in terms of these diversity initiatives as well. And then we can bring structure to our unstructured processes, from recruiting to hiring to reporting. And we spoke about how Plum aids you in that. Also, in terms of that unfreeze approach of your efforts, ensuring that this is constant, this is iterative, this doesn't stop in terms of reaching a final destination. We're always trying to improve in our D&I efforts. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Denise and Thomas. It's been great learning from you throughout this process, even in the prep. It's been fun on my part. Thank you for joining us for this jam session. And if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with us, and we'll be happy to respond. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your next day.
Thank you.
Bye now.